Okay, so we've just finished our levels of play study for Platinum. I started with IBS, I skipped past Gold, we did Platinum because when we come back to Gold, it's going to kind of be like the marriage between IBS and Plat, right? So it's just easier to do it this way. Plus, with Platinum, I have a lot more personal experience, like playing in Platinum Amateur Leagues, coaching Platinum Amateur Leagues, just I have a lot more connections in Platinum. It's easier to understand what the tendencies are for me, right? So how does Platinum work? How do we optimize our strategies for Platinum Amateur Leagues? Well, the number one thing to understand are the core fundamentals. Like, players understand the basics of the game, but that's the key. Players understand the basics. Anything beyond that, anything more complicated, specifics, advanced concepts, they will start to struggle to apply that. In Platinum, we have very limited mental stacks. We can't process all of the information at once. We don't want this extra layer of complexity, this extra warp factor that changes everything, because that's how communication breaks down. That's how macro calls get made incorrectly. That's how the game gets very, very messy very fast, right? Players struggle to think quickly and creatively. Once a fight is broken out, it's going to be hard to process more information, so some macro stuff can slip by, right? Warp factors win just off that level of discomfort with advanced concepts, specifics, things that shake up the fundamentals. That is the key principle of Platinum, warp factors. The other most important thing is that players do struggle to play reactively in Platinum. And think about why this is, right? In solo queue, we learn how to push the tempo. We learn how to play aggressively. We learn how to win lane, win game. We learn how to, like, kind of mold ourselves to the chaos of, like, all of this fighting in solo queue when things aren't kind of playing out properly. So those are the basics that were learned, right? The basics that were learned aren't how to play slowly as a team, slowly choking out the enemy's options until they have no options left and you win through that sort of scaling. We don't get to predict nearly as reliably what's going on in the enemy's heads, because we only really have room for, like, our basics and our games. So control, reactive play, definitely not what we like to do in Platinum. In Platinum, players will make very, very frequent mistakes, but you can no longer reliably predict what those frequent mistakes will be. It's very improper to draft around those mistakes. So you don't want to, like, explicitly draft around mistakes, but you do want to favor champions who can punish mistakes a lot more easily, right? We expect autopilot and macro inaccuracies above all. So, like, that's kind of the tendency, but again, we can't, like, predict exactly what's going on. Don't be as disrespectful as, like, say, in IBS drafts, right? So, matchups in Platinum start to matter for sure. It's not like IBS where you just pick for synergy. Your draft starts to matter, your comp starts to matter, like, you actually have to make reasonable decisions in your draft. But not every type of matchup is created equally. So, yeah, as I said, matchup dynamics start to matter more. That stems from basic laning and jungling fundamentals being in place. You can more reliably predict what's going to happen. But archetype-based matchups or range-based matchups, those are the ones that matter, right? And by range-based matchups, I mean when one champion just straight outranges the other, like mage versus mage matchups in the mid lane, that is a major factor. It does very regularly contribute to how the matchup plays out. Archetype-based matchups are like, say, bot lane stuff, like Wardens will almost always lose to mages. Certain tanks will always lose to certain skirmishers top lane, like stuff like that. Those are archetype-based matchups. But interaction-based matchups, those remain unpredictable in Platinum, right? If players must capitalize on small, temporary moments to win their matchups, that matchup will rarely swing as drastically as it would in theory. If a winning matchup requires literally no conscious thought from the winner, or if there are absolutely no available winning interactions for one player, then yes, the interaction-based matchup will swing as expected. You kind of can't get around that type of thing. But if it's just more subtle than that, as we said, it won't swing. Platinum players are more likely to find themselves in a position where they can't generate their winning interactions, or because specifics can be hard, Platinum players are more likely to not even know what their exact winning interactions are, right? So think about Zyra Thresh, right? Zyra is expected to win that matchup, but it only takes one moment of Thresh having bush control, and all of a sudden the matchup has not swung as expected. Maybe the Zyra player's more likely to cede that bush control, right? So if you would win or lose off specific trading patterns at specific times, that is highly likely not to occur. That's like a Gragas situation top lane, where he just loses to some champions pre-6 before, like, that he's incapable of body slamming away while he still has to interact with the wave. Sometimes that just doesn't happen. It's kind of funny. If you can knowledge check players with weaker laners who are waiting for their windows of power, like, great. That's awesome. I actually, in fact, often you can knowledge check is what I wrote, but... So the TLDR of this one is, if it is possible to outplay your opponent without demanding absurd levels of proficiency, that matchup will not always play out as expected, because you will probably be able to find those outplay windows if you're the better player. Players have the basics understood. They're not always optimizing their survivability or threat, though. Their positioning isn't perfect, it's understood. That being said, raw champion power is not the most important thing at this level. We'll see that later, for sure. It was kind of a fun conclusion to draw. But that's especially true if powerful champions have to go through interaction-based matchups to unlock that power. So that's the TLDR of matchups in Platinum. They matter, drafts matter, until this funny little wrinkle starts to factor in, right? Speaking of team compositions, though, archetypes. Compositional matchups are shockingly devalued. Like, they are surprisingly not important. And it's usually because Platinum players are a little bit stuck in their ways of, like, how to play the game. They can't really mold to the more complex, weird, like, compositional styles, right? So dive becomes more powerful in Platinum because the natural counter to dive is bait and punish, but bait and punish is a control comp that forces you to play reactively, and if we know Platinum players struggle with that very often, I mean, I've seen it firsthand so many times, the bait and punish just doesn't win where it should. So control archetypes are consistently terrible for that reason, right? Control champions can be strong as long as they don't single-handedly define the archetype that you're playing, and even then, like, they're probably, like, a little bit weaker than they would be in theory. Teamfight and aggro archetypes, like, most of them are fine. Platinum players know how to use their leads, they know how to play aggressively, they know how to play, like, aggro strats, they know how to play teamfight strats, that's what they've been trained on, right? But aggro archetypes tend to have a slight edge in Platinum. Why? Because players have solid laning fundamentals but still make frequent mistakes, and because players have basic macro fundamentals and therefore have an idea of how to actually snowball their lead without seeing the same number of throws as you would observe in, like, IBS Amateur. Right? So that's everything about, like, the matchups and stuff. Now let's talk about the actual gameplay a little bit more, starting with the most common problem, synchronization and wave management. Synchronization with teammates is not very good. Remember, Platinum players have their basic fundamentals. Specifics are hard. That applies to their teammates as well. So Plat players generally have a hard time understanding in the moment what specifically their teammates might need from them in both micro and macro. It's like genuinely difficult. If you know what your teammates need from you, you actually stand out as a player a lot. Waves don't often get synced very often on mid-game pushes. They're out of sync, it's easier to deal with. Players are almost always out of sync with their atypical duos, so if you're not bot support or not jungle mid, you're probably not working great together yet, which, note that jungle support is one of those atypical duos, which means the vision game can be lacking a little bit. Even if it's more developed, there are holes that you can find and exploit, right? Side lanes can struggle to set up waves properly to accommodate jungle and mid intervention, so champions that require proper wave management to counter or dive are a little bit empowered. It's a little bit harder to dive, and when they do dive, they're going to give up a little more, because you'll find, like, hey, that roam wasn't quite set up properly, that wasn't quite the right time. I can actually, like, the mid lane can now take a plate that ordinarily they shouldn't be allowed to take, right? Like, that's, where's that point? Like, right here, it's actually just the exact next point. Perfect. Another important thing is that Platinum players will very frequently send too many players to make a play because they don't always know exactly which champions are necessary for their play. The macro basics are there, the specifics are not. Noticing a trend, that's kind of how this works. So if you notice that happen, be prepared to punish on macro. I can't tell you how many times my teams have sent like 4 people bot to lose Baron. I can't tell you how many times my teams have taken the Baron off the enemy sending 4 people bot inappropriately. Like, this happens all the time. Way too many people involved in a play when it should be just be like 2 or 3 people, and you should trust that they know how to execute that play. So always be ready to sacrifice something in order to get greater value on the map, and note that junglers will almost never show in a lane solely for a tempo push. Right? You're not going to have that kind of synchronous pressure. And speaking of the jungle took like very specific understanding, because it's a little bit different. Junglers do understand the fundamentals of tracking and responding to plays. It's obvious that they do. The laners are clueless. The laners have no idea what's actually going on in jungle dynamics. But the junglers have the basics, but not the specifics. And so what you end up seeing is a lot of handshaking, a lot of like cross maps, a lot of like missed opportunities to take like very aggressive leads. Like the X factor that makes for really truly great junglers is almost never there. They're just good junglers. So the only common jungle versus jungle interaction you will see is on late invades, actual skirmish, and on the most obvious counter ganks. Like, they know how to identify counter ganks. They'll go for that unless it's like shocking and weird, you know, like. So if it's not a lane-based event, junglers probably won't push their leads as well as they can. So what does that mean? That means that if you're in a jungle v jungle matchup where you have like low health and they have an excellent invade and could feasibly find an invade without prio and make it before a lane collapse, that's probably not happening. I've seen it literally once in a Platinum game, and that player probably was ready to move on to Diamond Amateur. So the only invades you see are the obvious ones. Like a team invades off very obvious prio with an obviously stronger jungler, or a jungler takes a cross-map resource invade. Like the ones that you can just be reasonably expected to see because they're very standard, and the ones that you can reasonably path around and predict, those are the ones that are coming. Remember that the ability to take invades hinges on the ability to generate information, but jungle support synergy is lacking, right? So this is the point that I mentioned about like junglers never taking their like very momentary 1v1s, like that sort of thing. The conclusions we draw from this are that clear speed doesn't really matter in Platinum. Junglers do not consistently enough create advantages off being slightly faster than their opponents because we're expecting a lot of small inaccuracies and mistakes. Clear health can matter, but only if it would expose laners to unanswered plays, because remember, you're not being surprise invaded off the knowledge that your champion has an unhealthy clear. It's only if you could do nothing in response to an enemy play solely because your HP is low. That's bad because aggro wins in Platinum. Right? And champion-specific vulnerabilities are rarely capitalized on. Like if your champion is just known to be mandatorily locked to a full clear just off some weird property of them, you're not seeing more 3-camp into ganks than you ordinarily would, if that makes sense. And of course, now that we've talked about the jungle, we have to talk about the big thing, the warp factor. We touched on this very briefly at the beginning. If a champion fundamentally changes how the game is played for their enemies, they have a high warp factor, and they are significantly more effective in Platinum play. Like, by a wide margin, these champions are so much more powerful. If a champion fundamentally changes how the game is played for their allies, that warp factor can be a detriment, though, because your allies are also Plat players. Your allies are not going to be able to mold their game plan very comfortably. That said, you can allocate specific practice time to this, and you can get the hang of it, provided that the warp factor lends itself to proactive play and doesn't, like, fundamentally change the entire game. It's just harder and requires more, like, dedicated training. So when we start talking about the actual champions, you'll see champions with ally warp factors being slightly devalued, right? If a champion fundamentally changes how the game is played for only their player, there is no real difference in power. You should know how to play your champion. Like, Plat players do struggle to change the way they play, but at the same time, they may be simply comfortable on a weird champion, right? Like, the champion can be weird, but you just learned the champ and you're good. That happens. That's okay. So now we're going to move more specifically into how champion power levels change in Platinum, and so I just want to introduce some of the gates and boons that are specific to Platinum. Now, I want to mention, before we go deep into this, I'm not convinced that this gate list is complete. I think it is very possible that we've missed one or two things, and we'll see the consequences of that later. But for now, what limits you in Platinum? Well, being a fundamentally reactive, control-oriented champion, that limits your power. Unless the team around you is all very proactive, right? But as we mentioned, if you default to control archetypes as a champion, you are a weaker champion. You don't like being in a control comp in Platinum. It's always bad. Being an aggro champ that relies on specific synchronous macro movements is also very damning. Remember, the synchronization issue is like the biggest problem that we can encounter here. So champions who rely on taking over the game via like time-specific like tempo plays, turret plates, stuff like that. That type of aggro strategy is weakened. You like simple aggro that just kills things. Complex macro aggro isn't quite there yet, right? If you must plan for your power like 2 to 3 minutes in the future, you do encounter a problem with your mental stack. It's just hard to keep track of all that information. And demanding specific micro or macro attention from your allies complicates the game. Remember, we're not great at identifying what specifically our teammates need from us yet. This one, I also think can probably be compensated for by practice, but like, it takes a lot of time. Now, the boons, on the other hand, there's a lot more of these. We mentioned warp factors above all, big. Being fundamentally proactive and aggressive augments power. Offensive utility is really, really good down here. Like, you don't want to just be purely defensive utility most of the time, with exceptions, asterisk. Big utility spells that help you to fight and win and aggress tend to dominate down here. If all of your matchups are interaction-based, as we said, you are generally easier to pick, and that unlocks power in the draft. Big skill shot. I just wrote big skill shots, and I said big skill shots like probably 15, 20 times while making these lists that you're about to see, 'cause it's just fun to say. Combat stacking mechanics like Syndra Shards, Victor Augments, Vagar stacks, things like that, like things that you can stack by fighting champions. These increase power levels. Why? Because they prey on the greater aggression of Platinum that is executed with lower precision. I've called some champions one bad day champions, where like just one thing has to go wrong and they take over the game. Platinum is like the peak for these champions, like where they just really, really and truly dominate. Like if you need to only commit one mistake to lose to them, watch out. In the top lane, because we have these mental stack issues and these like frequent resource allocation issues where we're sending too many people to sides, hard split push after the enemy solo laner can no longer match you does get responded to improperly, and so it actually augments your value as a champion. You just have to make sure, you have to spend specific time making sure you are stronger than your laner, or split push is not inherently a boon. It's not like IBS where you just split push and win. You have to split push a little more, like with a little more of an advantage than that, but it's still a boon. And in bot lane, the poor wave clear from the AD carry is not going to be punished as severely off some like wave management errors. And we'll see champs like Vayne who profit from that a little bit, who like realistically should not be allowed to be picked, but it ends up working out sometimes. Okay, so those are the fundamentals of Platinum play. Now we're going to start talking about like specific champion power in the context of a tier list, but it's not exactly a tier list this time, right? If you remember in the IBS video, I talked about how we're not quite sure if those tier lists actually matter right now, because like you should only see, like you should only play the champions you're actually really good at, and so does an arbitrary list matter to you? I kind of got weirded out by it, so this time what I've done is I've created, not a tier list, but like a lens list. We have started sorting champions by how improved or devalued they are in the elo. So you're going to see noticeably weaker champions placed higher than obviously stronger champions. Let me explain, right? This is our bot lane list, and I'll explain the tiers in a moment. Yeah, not all of these champions that are higher on the list are in theory stronger than the champions who are lower. So what this is a lens through which you look at a champion, you take their theoretical power, you filter it through these tiers, and you can kind of get a rough idea of like how much better or worse they are than theory, right? So the ideal platinum champions would hit like all of these necessary boons, like big warp factors, like all the properties that we just explained that we like to see. Unlocked champions like they're noticeably stronger and they generate more pick conditions. Empowered champions are noticeably stronger. Enhanced champions just get a little bit of extra power through these properties. The no change champions are like probably exactly as strong as they are in theory in practical platinum. Slightly devalued champions will hit like a gate or like a control thing. Impaired champions, like now we're starting to talk about like some negative warp factors or like some weird ways that you have to like play with your teammates that they might not be comfortable with, or just like some miscellaneous other gate. Gated champions are the ones, like, it's the counterpart to unlocked. These champions lose pick conditions. If they would be strong in theory, you probably can't actually pick them in Platinum through various reasons. And then doomed champions are champions who, like, regardless of power, just, like, don't really function in Platinum. Now, these lists are going to be noticeably top-heavy, right? There's going to be a lot more champions in the upper tiers that say these are better champions in Platinum than they are in theory, than there are in the lower tiers, and that's not an accident. So the conclusion that we eventually drew, even if I'm missing a couple of gates, which we'll be exploring as time goes on, and hopefully, like, you know, we'll just make a decision now, build knowledge later, iterate on it, that sort of thing, right? The conclusion that we drew was that, yeah, most champions are actually just, like, a little bit improved. There just are more viable champions in Practical Platinum. So, like, that's kind of the feeling that we're rolling with right now. So let's talk about bot lane, right? I mean, Twitch, Giga Warp Factor, the stealth, like, completely changes games. Draven is just, like, this ticking time bomb, like, mental stack check that, like, pressures you constantly. Like, these champions are just most likely to take over Platinum in their dynamics. Seraphine is unlocked. She gets more pick conditions, right? She hits offensive utility. She hits big skill shots. You're going to see a lot of, like, kind of vaguely controlled champions still in the list, solely because they are dominant utility that empowers people offensively. Like, I do not see Seraphine lose in Platinum very often. She's just not going to be punished as hard. Then you go through these champions, like, anything that is, like, vaguely aggressive is probably going to be a little bit better, right? There's a lot of bad day champions here in the empowered tier, where it's like you give one kill to Samira, you give one kill to Kaisa, the game gets out of control. Generally, the champions that are better are the ones that are just going to be more capable of fighting, right? And so then we get down to slightly devalued, right? Caitlyn's a bit of a weird one because at the time of recording, she's so dominant, but, like, at the end of the day, the way she snowballs is through synchronous map movements, and that doesn't work as well. You're going to see a lot of anchors, which are champions who like being engaged on and like to play reactively, like Xayah and Aphelios, who get a little bit devalued here. Senna is all the way down here because from the AD carries perspective, like, it's very... Like, if the AD carry player is locking in fasting Senna, it becomes uncomfortable for the Platinum support very quickly to have to change their responsibilities, change the way they approach lane. And so that does actually, on a lot of Platinum teams, start to impose some gates. You would have to practice that very specifically. I also want to just add a disclaimer before we move on to the other ones that this is a first draft. We did just make a decision and commit to it, and we'll learn more later. So if you actually disagree with any of these tiers or something, like, feel free to leave a comment. I'm totally happy with that. I'm totally happy to discuss, because everything here is ultimately a work in progress. Right? This is what we've kind of described for the jungle. Again, what is dominating up here is, like, warp factors. What do these champions contribute? Oh, big global, like, surprise, we're fighting moments from a lack of vision. Complete invisibility, which now you have to change. Like, Platinum players hate stealth. They hate stealth so much. It is deeply uncomfortable to have to forfeit a mid-wave because of, like, a lack of information that you usually don't have to think about. We're seeing a lot of aggro champs that get improved. Like, Fiddlesticks is only not in ideal because he actually has a warp factor that slightly negatively impacts his teammates, unless you just, like, cover him and engage champions, and then you can kind of get away with it, but... yeah. And then as we're going into the empowered champions here, like, you're just seeing a lot of, like, big, like, some of them are very aggro champs. Some of them are just champs who, like, get away with their clears not being punished, through the jungle 1v1 dynamics that we described earlier. Ivern in particular is here because he has a champion-specific vulnerability in the very early game that doesn't get capitalized on, and because, like, he does have a warp factor of his own by just disrupting timings, like, when is he going to gank, when is he finishing his clear. It's different, it changes throughout the game, it's not the orthodox timers, and so he does very often surprise laners because the junglers aren't warning the laners of, like, those weird distorted times, right? Of the champions that are slightly devalued, again, we have a lot of, like, very reactive picks that have lesser agency in the moment. We have Olaf, who in Modern League has kind of become a scaling pick, who gains his power through, like, specific enchanter synergies, and you have to play the game around him a little differently, and so again, a little uncomfortable, a little different. Gwen is way down here because, like, Jungle Gwen is a very specific strategy for, like, Hypercarry Enchanter archetypes or, like, Bait and Punish archetypes, and, like, we don't really want to deal with control-leaning stuff like that, especially as extreme as, like, Jungle Gwen, right? Moving on to mid lane. This is where we definitely start to see some of those scaling champions, like, being unusually highly valued for an elo in which we said, like, aggro does win often. The only thing I'm going to say about this is, like, when is the last time you actually saw Zilean lose a platinum amateur game? It just kind of doesn't happen. Twisted Fate was a bit contentious. When his ultimate is strong, like, it just breaks the game, and platinum players cannot deal with that. But at the same time, like, it is, like, a thing that your team has to play around. So, like, you could argue for him moving down to tier 2, like, whatever. Katarina's a one bad day champion, just gains more pick condition. Like, this is the perfect storm in Platinum, where, like, the mechanical proficiency is high enough to play Katarina well, and the general awareness is low enough just for her to, like, get that one moment that she desperately needs. Right? This is critical mass Katarina elo. Empowered, we're seeing a lot of warp factors. Zoe warp factor through walls, how she changes how you have to interact with terrain. Twitch, like, stealth again. Seraphine, who just has the big utility spells and tends to win. We have this collection of champions who have stacking mechanics. We have Cassidon, who doesn't get punished as much and then scales into a champion that can be very proactive. Roamer, warp factor, and one bad day champ, like warp factor. Right? It's pretty clear what's dominating these tiers. You're going to see a couple of, like, control-oriented champions and no change, mainly because, like, the flavor of control offered by Malzahar and Anivia doesn't, like, force you into a control archetype. It's just really, really, really good at punishing mistakes, so they don't get devalued. Vhagar actually would have been devalued, because at the time of recording, his systems don't lend themselves well to aggressive play. He doesn't have a strong Predator. He doesn't have a strong Everfrost. He's very reactive, but he's salvaged a bit by the stacking mechanics through combat, right? And then what's slightly devalued in the mid lane? Azir being here can be controversial, right? The reason I have him here is because if you pick him too early, he does create a tendency to have to draft control. The general artillery champions, same deal. These very reactive champions. Gangplank doesn't have the same level of agency in mid lane as he does in top lane. It's pretty clear why everyone is sort of here. And then we have the, like, two scaling champions in Impaired. The reasoning that they end up down here and Cassidon is allowed to be up here, even though they're not going to be punished in lane as hard as they would, the payoff for these champions is, again, like, very pure artillery and, like, very defensive output. So, that's why they don't thrive as much in the context of Platinum. Going to support, we have a funny little graphic because I got lazy and didn't want to remake the graphic. I do want to point out Doomed. This tier's not very accurate. I put this here as a joke for one of my viewers who likes Misfortune support, and Misfortune support is not strong, but it's not inherently worse for being in Platinum, right? And that should be the point of the tier list. Right? So what dominates here? Oh, look, some disgusting roamers. Oh, look, Zilean, who just wins. Platinum players know how to generate kills. Zilean stops them from generating kills, right? Obviously, Pyke is, like, the dominant aggro in Platinum. He dumpsters his lane, he terrorizes the map, he completely changes how the game is played. Similar to Bard, the only reason Bard doesn't make the tier above is because he's not quite as strong in lane as well, right? Again, warp factors. What makes a noticeably stronger champion? Oh, Hybridinger. You can't play into him unless you're playing very specific types of champions, right? Twitch support. Stealth. Oh god, we hate that. Blitzcrank. Oh, he's just terrorizing the river, right? Rel actually gains a lot of value in Platinum because, like, the thing that causes her to lose is an interaction-based matchup. And you're not always getting, like, you're losing interactions if you're playing Rel in Platinum, right? What is devalued? Defensive champions. Sejuani support is a pick that very much relies on specific windows of power, like that window between, like, 15 to 25 minutes, or, like, more specifically 10 to 20 when she hits 6. Like, the strengths that she offers are very macro-based, and they are inherently aggressive, but they're, like, just weird. They're weirder to play around than something like Leona, even though I think she's a strong champion. Gragas very defensive, Nasus very defensive, Janna very defensive. Truthfully, I can't remember why I put Zoe here. So we'll move on. The champions that are gated are like these very synergy-reliant picks that like force your AD carry to play something specific to make them functional. But those specific picks aren't very common. Like Ivern and Rengar, you're not expecting that of your players in Platinum, right? Yeah, and so we'll just kind of speed on to top lane. Yes, we put Rengar up here. So there was a bit of a conversation in my Twitch chat while we were working on this, like, why does Rengar get to go up here, but Heimerdinger doesn't? The ultimate answer was, like, both of these champions are very differently oppressive in the lane phase. Like, Rengar is 100% knowledge checking you. He has very specific counterplay to what he does. If you're not used to laning against that, you will struggle a lot. The difference is Rengar snowballs into a menace aggressively around the map, whereas Heimerdinger snowballs into a lot more of a control thing, which we don't value in Platinum, especially since if he is the top laner, he's gaining less proactive access to his grenade, the kind of proactive access that he would gain from grouping with his team as a bot laner or a support, right? I think Shen is just the dominant top lane champion in Platinum play, again, for similar reasons as Zilean, where just it's a humongous warp factor, fundamentally changes the game. You go for a kill, you can't get it. It would work in non-Shen circumstances, but it's very, very difficult to factor in Shen with limited mental stacks, right? Gragas is here because a lot of his matchups are interaction-based, and so even in his bad matchups, it just creates more pick conditions for him. Again, that's what the unlocked here means. Empowered champions are like big skill shots, or like some of the champions who just become split push menaces and get those reactions of too many champions. Or they have like global threats like Pantheon. Like we do always value global threats. Or like, you know, Karma warps the game through very different trade dynamics where like the average top laner would expect she looks dead and then she isn't, and it's just annoying, you know? And I think that is all we really need to talk about with this list without getting very redundant. We can talk about Alawi for a little bit. This, I think, Platinum Elo is Alawi's worst trough. I think she is at her best in IBS level play where people just run into her, and then she troughs out as control comps get much worse, and then as you get closer, like Masters, Grandmasters, that sort of thing, Alawi gets better again, because those players should be reasonably expected to know how to play control, and Alawi drafted correctly is oppressive. They won't draft her incorrectly, so she like peaks again, right? That's probably like the only thing we really need to talk about impaired, devalued. And then in the doomed tier, we have these like giga specific, like I like Zilean top into Darius, like that sort of matchup, but that's realistically not the type of strategy you're going for to win Platinum games. So I've placed them in doomed tier. So Platinum play, pick warp factors, pick aggression, try to kill people. You don't know what mistakes are coming, but the mistakes are coming. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be funny. That's generally the types of lines we're going to be following.